crate arrived on a Sunday morning in late April of 1834, unmarked except for a wax seal bearing a symbol no one in town recognized, a bird pierced through with a needle, wings outstretched and mouth agape. The carriage that brought it departed before anyone could inquire, and when young Jonah Weaver, the stable boy at the Marlowe estate, opened the iron gates to receive it, he remarked only that the air around the box felt colder than the day itself. The Marlowe family, modestly regarded yet distantly influential, had lived in the manor on Grayson Hill for over 3 generations without much incident, but the arrival of this unrequested package would mark the quiet beginning of their unraveling. No one recalled placing an order. There were no receipts, no accompanying letter, and yet when Dr. Isaac Alden, physician to the county and longtime confidant of the late Judge Marlowe, was summoned to examine its contents, he found himself compelled by a private unease he could not name. The crate was brought into the study, where daylight through the tall windows was strangely dim that morning, casting the room in a gray neither overcast nor natural. The wood creaked as if resisting the blade used to pry it open, and when it finally yielded, the scent that poured out was neither rot nor spice, but something ferrous and cloying, like metal soaked in rainwater and left to stew with dried lilac. Inside were 2 things: a handbound folio tied with twine and sealed with a single red ribbon, and an object wrapped in oilcloth so thick it took Dr. Alden several minutes to unravel. Beneath the final layer lay a wooden carving no more than 15 inches tall, humanoid in form but faceless, its features left deliberately smooth except for a deep split where the mouth should have been. Someone had packed it with great care, as though it were both precious and dangerous. Dr. Alden, who had long maintained a posture of rational medicine in the face of frontier superstition, nonetheless found his hand trembling when he reached for the figure. That evening, after instructing the staff to burn the crate and its wrappings, he returned to his own home and began a new entry in a separate journal, one not meant for his medical records, but for what he called irregular observations. His handwriting in that book, later found buried beneath floorboards of his cellar, differed from his usual script, smaller, tighter, almost cramped in a way that suggested fear more than secrecy. He wrote that the carving was cold to the touch even after hours by the hearth, and that the folio, filled with unbound pages, appeared to be a transcription of someone's confession, though the language shifted between dialects and included symbols he could not translate. The final page, written in a darker ink, bore only a sentence: "We bury the voice so it cannot remember its shape." That night, the Marlowe estate reported the first of many incidents: a shattering mirror in the north hallway, with no one near it, and the horses in the stable refusing to drink. Miss Annabel Marlowe, eldest daughter of the late judge, sent word to Dr. Alden the next morning requesting a full examination of the household. She reported that her youngest sibling, 12-year-old Clara, had developed a sudden and unrelenting fever, accompanied by night terrors in which she would scream that someone was hiding in her tongue. The doctor complied and returned to the manor with medical kit in tow, but the moment he crossed the threshold, he felt something shift. The air inside the estate had taken on a thick, musty stillness, and the staff walked the halls with downcast eyes. When Alden examined Clara, he found no infection, no swelling, nothing that would account for her high temperature or unresponsive state, only a curious pattern of discoloration along her lower jaw, a half circle as if from pressure, like someone had once cupped her chin too tightly. Her tongue was whole, but when he asked to see it, the girl recoiled as if he had insulted her, whispering, "She lives there now. She's learning to speak again." He would later write that moment down 3 times, each entry with different wording, as if trying to convince himself of its banality. Over the next few days, the house began to deteriorate in ways that defied nature. Doors refused to stay shut, and hallways seemed longer than before. A dampness crept through the floors without rain, and the family's canary, kept in a parlor, fell silent and died with no visible ailment. It was only then that Dr. Alden remembered the box's symbol, the pierced bird, and began to suspect the carving was not an artifact, but a warning. He revisited the object in secret, having kept it against his better judgment, and noted that its surface was no longer dry. It wept a clear resin from its base, and when Alden wiped it away, he found the wood had darkened beneath as though absorbing something unseen. He placed it in a locked drawer and vowed to mention it to no one, not even his colleague at the Richmond Medical Society. But that night, he dreamed of the figure, taller now, standing in the hall outside his bedroom, its faceless head tilted as if listening to something behind the walls. When he awoke, his pillow was damp with blood from a bite on his own tongue. Days later, Annabel Marlowe confessed privately to Alden that they had once received a letter from Richmond, years prior, warning that an object had been misplaced and may eventually find its way home. She had dismissed it as misdelivered. She now believed the sender knew something about the house that they never dared explain. And still, the carving remained, never spoken of again by the family, yet never truly absent. It would outlast the fever, the disintegration of the estate, and the disappearance of the youngest child. And in time, when even the doctors of Richmond refused to acknowledge what the house once was, it would be found once more, waiting, still cold, in a drawer no one remembered locking. Dr. Isaac Alden began the secondary journal not out of professional necessity, but out of an instinct he could not articulate, a quiet compulsion that urged him to separate the Marlowe case from the clinical world of his usual medical practice. The journal was bound in rough cloth and kept behind a false panel in his writing desk, known only to him. In its first entry, dated April 29, 1834, he noted that Clara Marlowe's fever had neither risen nor broken, but the room around her had changed. Her curtains had molded overnight, despite no signs of moisture elsewhere, and her bedpost showed fresh splinters as if they had been clawed from the inside. The staff spoke little, their demeanor increasingly distant. One maid, Margaret, asked Alden if it was true that salt lines around the door kept voices from returning. When pressed, she would only say, "The baby in the wall is learning the house again." These comments, once dismissed as rural madness, were now recorded carefully in Alden's journal, alongside drawings of symbols that he found burned into the underside of Clara's nightstand, crude spirals, branching lines like trees struck by lightning, and a recurring motif of a mouth with no tongue. On May 1st, the doctor returned to the estate at Annabelle's request and found the girl sitting upright for the first time in days, her eyes unfocused but her lips moving silently. No sound came from her mouth, but Alden swore he heard a faint echo of her words somewhere else in the room, a kind of delayed whisper that arrived seconds after her lips stopped moving. He tested her hearing and found it strangely acute. She flinched when a moth's wings brushed against the window. Later that afternoon, Annabelle confided that their late father, Judge Thaddeus Marlowe, had once told him never to look too long into the fireplace in the study, claiming that things learned to look back. Alden, curious, examined the hearth and found beneath the grate a set of charred bones too small to be human, and yet undeniably shaped like hands. He photographed the remains using a primitive glass plate camera he had borrowed from the university in Richmond and locked the images away in a private drawer he would later never find again. He wrote in the journal that night that time moved differently inside the Marlowe home. Clocks seemed inconsistent. On one occasion, his pocket watch jumped ahead 7 minutes between blinks. Another time, the manor's grandfather clock struck 13 at midnight, its chime off-key and reverberating long after it should have faded. The house, he wrote, is trying to displace the familiar one breath at a time. On May 4th, the estate's cook suffered a sudden seizure while preparing broth and began screaming that her mouth was not her own. She bit clean through her lower lip before being subdued. Alden examined her that evening and discovered her tongue bore what looked like stitching scars, as though someone had sewn something into or out of it. Yet there was no history of surgery or trauma. In his journal, he sketched the injury and circled it several times, drawing an arrow that read, "Sewn voice, who taught her to speak again?" He began having dreams again, this time of the faceless wooden figure appearing in mirrors, always closer than it should have been. One night, he awoke to the sound of his own name being whispered in the voice of his mother, long dead. But it came from the ceiling. By the second week of his involvement, Dr. Alden began to believe the sickness afflicting the Marlowes was not of the body, but of the house itself. He wrote that the estate felt congested with something old, like breath being held for too long. On May 7th, he returned to check on Clara and found her missing. The family insisted she was sleeping, and indeed when he entered the nursery, he found her tucked in bed, but something was wrong. The air in the room was colder than the hallway, despite the fireplace roaring. Clara's skin had lost its sheen. Her limbs were stiff, unmoving. He checked her pulse, faint but present. But when he called her name, her lips curled into a smile he later described as rehearsed. He asked what she had dreamed of. She replied, "I was with her in the red curtains. She taught me a rhyme. It's time to go into the walls." Alden excused himself and immediately wrote the exchange into the journal, scratching so hard the nib of his pen tore the page. He then returned to the study, where he laid out every item from the crate once again. The faceless doll, now sticky with resin, the folio, which now bore new notations he did not recall, and the crate's broken plank, which still carried the scent of rusted lilac. Alden noted that 2 pages from the folio were missing, and in their place was a lock of hair tied with red thread. He refused to test it for origin, but wrote down the words on the adjacent page. To bind the voice, place its name where no one listens. Feed it silence until it forgets the shape of sound. In the final portion of the journal's second week, Alden turned to his colleague Dr. Enoch Fry in Richmond via coded letter, using symbols derived from his study of early Appalachian folklore. He never received a reply, but several weeks later, Fry's assistant arrived alone, pale and bearing no luggage. The man, unnamed, stayed only one night in the village and before vanishing. The innkeeper said he had left behind a single item, a black feather unnaturally long, placed beneath the pillow. Alden ended that journal entry with a single phrase: "They are teaching the air to hold memory." By May 10th, the Marlowe household had lost 3 staff members to resignation, 1 to madness, and the cook had vanished. The doctor, now isolated in his knowledge and suspecting something buried far deeper than he could reach, began writing as if the journal were not for others, but for the house itself. He started addressing it directly. "You have hidden her in your mouth, haven't you? You swallowed the name before I arrived." He noted how rooms changed sizes depending on who entered, how windows faced new directions each morning, and how Clara now drew pictures with charcoal of a tall figure holding a child by the mouth. On May 12th, Dr. Alden wrote the final line of that journal entry before hiding the book again. "She is not sick. She is hosting. The girl is no longer alone in her body." What he meant, no one can say. But years later, when the journal was uncovered beneath his former home, those words were still legible, even as the ink around them had faded to nothing. It began with the walls murmuring at dusk, soft at first, like wind passing through loose plaster, but within days, the whispers sharpened, words slurring into syllables that formed Clara's name and something else, something no one could spell. The second floor of the Marlowe estate, long known as the family's private quarters, had become unnavigable by anyone not of the bloodline. Servants refused to enter past twilight, and even Annabelle, who had kept order since their father's death, admitted to avoiding the Upper West Corridor entirely. It was there, near the sealed nursery and across from the once gilded portrait hall, that sounds were heard most often, scratching from inside the wall panels, sobbing that seemed to rise from the floorboards, and the unmistakable lull of a woman singing an unfamiliar tune in a language no one could identify. The house staff began referring to that section of the home as her mouth, saying that the manor had developed a second voice, a quieter one that listened more than it spoke. One evening, a housemaid named Eloise, newly hired and unfamiliar with the household's quiet terrors, was asked to deliver fresh linens to Clara's room. She never reached the door. Several minutes after ascending the main staircase, she was heard screaming. When Dr. Alden and Annabelle found her, she was curled at the base of the hallway window, her eyes locked on the wainscoting, repeating a single phrase, "There's someone behind it," pressing back. Upon closer inspection, the wallpaper in that hallway had begun to peel, and beneath the paper, claw marks had been etched into the plaster, deep, symmetrical, and in sets of 4. That night, Alden recorded in his private journal that the air near the top of the stairs was denser, and his ears popped as though the floor held a pressure of its own. Clara's drawings grew more disturbing, her once soft sketches now replaced with violent black lines, stick figures with missing mouths, and staircases leading into tongues. When asked why she drew such things, she answered plainly, "I only copy what the lady in the wall shows me." Annabelle confessed to Alden that she had heard the same lullaby, always beginning near midnight, always ending in the sound of something heavy being dragged. She recalled it from childhood, but only in fragments, as if the memory had been broken and hidden. The family butler, Mr. Griggs, an aging man with 30 years of loyal service, submitted his resignation on May 17th. His reason was brief: "The house is trying to speak through me." That same day, the mirror in the second-floor washroom shattered into clean halves, unbroken on a floor, as if it had been sliced rather than dropped. When the fragments were reassembled, the reflection showed not the room behind, but what appeared to be the hallway as it looked decades ago, dustless, candlelit, and occupied by a pale figure seated at the end, face obscured by shadow. That mirror was later buried beneath the garden fountain, per Alden's request, though the fountain dried up the next morning and never refilled. Alden wrote in his journal that the second floor seemed to be rewriting itself, not physically, but perceptually. Angles changed, shadows persisted in places that had no light source, and distances grew elastic. The linen closet appeared to extend backward endlessly one night, filled with only child-sized dresses that Annabelle swore had not belonged to any known family member. One servant claimed to have heard a conversation through a locked bedroom, 2 voices speaking in unison, one deep and resonant, the other faint and rapid, like a whisper over glass. That room had been empty for months. On May 19th, Alden brought with him a young theological scholar from the seminary in Staunton. hoping to test whether sacred objects or scripture might agitate or pacify the phenomenon. The man, barely 20, entered the upper hallway carrying a rosary and a satchel of psalms. He lasted 9 minutes. When he descended, his left eye was hemorrhaged, and he wept blood as he claimed that the tongue on a wall had told him it used to be someone. He repeated, "She remembers the Red Room," and was never seen in public again. It was becoming clearer to Alden that what plagued the Marlowe house was not a singular entity, but a process, an ongoing event stitched into the very design of the manor. On several occasions, he noted that the wallpaper patterns along the second floor pulsed, subtly but consistently, as though the walls themselves were breathing. At night, doors opened by themselves, not slammed or flung, but gently parted, like someone stepping through cautiously. When Alden and Annabelle tested this phenomenon, they left chalk lines across the thresholds. The lines were found distorted the next morning, as if dragged by something with fingers. The scratching inside the walls intensified and took on rhythm. It was no longer random, it was patterned, almost musical. Clara began humming the melody in her sleep. She was never taught the tune. One evening, Alden overheard her counting the knocks and responding with her own taps, creating a kind of call-and response with something unseen. When asked what she was doing, she replied, "Practicing. If I get it right, she says I can come inside." That night, Annabelle dreamt she found her sister already gone, dissolved into the wall like smoke. At the suggestion of burning sage or consecrating the rooms, Alden offered no support, writing in his journal that whatever is here predates God's memory, or perhaps refuses it. He became increasingly convinced that the second floor was acting as a conduit, a mouthpiece for something buried beneath memory and tradition. On May 21st, a carpenter hired to repair the nursery door refused to enter the second floor, stating he had seen his own mother behind a closed door, even though she had died when he was 12. The last staff member to leave was Margaret, the maid who first spoke of Salt. She dropped her apron in the front parlor and said only, "She's awake now." When pressed for who, she walked barefoot into the field beyond the orchard and was never found again. Clara's condition stabilized, but not in the way Alden had hoped. She no longer registered visitors as individuals, only as shapes, and spoke with unusual syntax, using plural pronouns when referring to herself. "We drew a picture. We like this room." On May 23rd, a thunderstorm passed over Grayson Hill, and lightning struck the north turret of the manor. The fire that followed was quickly extinguished, but the second-floor corridor remained blackened. Alden noted that the soot left behind bore impressions, not smoke damage, but the outlines of fingers pressed outward from within the wall, as though someone had been trying to escape. The whispers, by now, had become part of the estate's rhythm, indistinguishable from the creaking of floors and the rustle of trees. Visitors no longer asked what they heard. They simply left sooner. Dr. Alden, now a shadow of the man who first arrived with skepticism and medicine, recorded in his journal, "The house has learned to speak. I fear the child was only its first word. She arrived just before dusk, a silhouette against the reddening sky, her black veil trailing like smoke in the soft Virginia wind, and no one in the house recognized her. The woman said her name was Mrs. Ione Caldwell, claiming to be a distant cousin from the paternal line, though neither Annabelle nor Dr. Alden could locate any record of her in the Marlowe family tree. She brought no luggage, only a worn leather satchel and a parcel wrapped in oilskin, and insisted she would stay only until nightfall. Her presence unsettled the staff immediately. Margaret, who had not yet vanished, refused to meet her eyes, muttering beneath her breath that mourners walk backwards when they leave. Ione walked through the manor as though she had once memorized it in a dream, her gloved hands grazing the balustrade, her steps slow and measured, pausing at thresholds as if expecting the doors to inhale. In the drawing room, she lingered before the grand mirror, tilting her head as though listening for something on the other side. When she finally addressed the family, her voice was calm, too calm, the tone of someone repeating words they'd practiced in a foreign tongue. "You've left the nursery open too long. That was unwise." No one had told her about the nursery. No one could say how she knew. Annabelle attempted to assert authority, explaining the strange incidents as illness and hallucination, but the woman only smiled, a pale, joyless expression that never reached her eyes. She placed the parcel on the parlor table, unwrapped it to reveal a bundle of dried herbs bound with sinew, and said, "If you burn these, she'll speak softer." Clara, who had been standing silently behind the doorframe, whispered, "That's the one from the red curtain." Dr. Alden noted the phrase in his journal with a shaking hand, aware that the child had never before mentioned the curtain aloud to a stranger. As the sun dipped below the hills, Ione requested to see the nursery, despite Annabelle's protests. The door had remained nailed shut for days now, but without being prompted, the visitor reached into her satchel and produced an iron key. He kept it hidden in the study, she said, behind the portrait of the boy who was erased. Annabelle paled, for that painting had indeed once hung in the study, a cousin who died young and had been painted over out of superstition. They found the keyhole behind a strip of molding near the baseboard, a detail Alden had missed during his earlier inspections. As Ione unlocked the door, the air shifted, warm to cold in a blink, and the scent of lilac and rust returned. She stepped into the nursery and stood still for nearly 10 minutes. No one followed. From the hallway, Alden watched her lips move as though in prayer, though the words made no sense. Sharp consonants, no pauses, something between chant and cough. When she emerged, she said only, "She's still in the in-between. You fed her, but haven't named her." She then handed Alden a small folded paper and warned, "When the mouth learns its name, it chews." The paper contained a child's drawing not unlike Clara's, stick figures in a circle, one larger than the rest with arms that extended beyond the page, and a single word, Selitha. The moment he read it, Alden reported hearing something fall upstairs, a crash, like a wardrobe tipping over, followed by the sound of someone exhaling through water. Ione insisted on leaving immediately after sunset. She refused supper, refused coin, and when asked where she would go, replied only, backwards, like grief. As she walked down the drive, the wind picked up, and those watching from the porch swore that her veil never moved. That night, the house was silent. No whispers, no scratching, just an eerie calm that lasted precisely 6 hours. At dawn, the family dog, a sheepdog named Guster, who had barked relentlessly at the upper floors for weeks, was found dead in the drawing room. His body was untouched, no blood or bruises, but his eyes had been removed and placed gently on the windowsill. Dr. Alden did not report this to the authorities. He merely wrote in the journal, "The mouth has tasted loss. She has grown teeth." Clara did not speak for 2 days after Ione's visit. When she finally did, her voice was deeper, foreign, halting. She spoke a name that did not belong to her. "My name is not Clara anymore." She refused to say what her new name was, but she began folding her drawings and tucking them beneath the floorboards, whispering over them as though they were seeds. Annabelle awoke one night to find her sister standing at the foot of her bed, eyes closed, hands folded. "She says it's your turn next," Clara said. That morning, Annabelle's bed sheets were covered in tiny black feathers, though no birds had been inside. Dr. Alden attempted to track down Ione Caldwell through church records, census logs, and even the Marlowe family Bible. There was no mention of her, not even a surname match. He sent inquiries to Charleston, Richmond, and Savannah, and received no responses except for a package that arrived weeks later from a monastery in New Hampshire. Inside was a hand-copied ledger detailing sightings of a woman in black dating back to 1799, always appearing before unexplained disappearances or unvoicing incidents, as the monks called them. The final page bore a note in Latin, "She carries silence as gift and blade." Alden stored the ledger beside the folio, wrapped both in cloth, and buried them beneath the floorboards of his apothecary. He no longer believed this was a case. It was an inheritance. He began to dream of Ione standing behind him in mirrors, face obscured but posture unmistakable. In his last entry regarding her, he wrote, "She was not sent. She was summoned by the house itself. And we are too late to ask who knocked first, the girl or the door." It was June 3, 1834, the night the sky over Grayson Hill held no moon, and the Marlowe house trembled with something that no weather could explain, a vibration that passed through the floorboards and into the marrow of every person inside, as if the house itself was grinding its teeth. The decision to seal the nursery was not made out loud but passed in glances and silence, and when it happened, it was swift, coordinated, as if all who remained knew it had to be done. The day had begun with Clara vanishing for 6 full hours, only to be found curled inside the wardrobe in the guest room, her dress soaked in something sticky and gray, her hands cold, and her lips moving with no sound. When Annabelle lifted her out, she opened her eyes and said, "I was showing her where the walls end." That evening, Dr. Alden, whose face had grown haggard and distant with each visit, stood with 3 members of the household staff in front of the nursery door, hammer and nails in hand, the hinges already groaning before a single tool was raised. They had removed the dolls and rocking horse days ago, but still the room refused to be empty. Alden wrote later that the air inside felt denser than outside by full degrees, and when he stepped across the threshold, his candle flickered blue. They worked quickly, boards placed diagonally across the doorframe, nails driven deep and irregularly, as if trying to confuse whatever might try to remember its way back out. Clara watched from the staircase, her head tilted slightly, humming the tune that had no source, her fingers curled in the shape of something not quite a fist, not quite a claw. When the final board was placed, Annabelle whispered something that only Alden heard. We should have never let her open the box. No one asked what box she meant. That night, the sound began. A slow knocking, not from the sealed door, but from inside the walls nearby, rhythmic, patient, deliberate. It came every 27 minutes as precisely as the tolling of a clock, and every time it echoed, something small in the house changed. A picture frame turned upside down, a vase of flowers dried instantly, a chair slid 2 inches closer to the fireplace. At midnight, Clara sat up in bed and said, "She's licking the nails." Alden, who was staying in the Manor's East Room, noted that the painting of the estate's founder had shifted its expression overnight. What had once been a stern frown now hinted at a smile, crooked and far too wide. Margaret, still shaken from her encounter days prior, claimed that while cleaning the second floor, she found tiny footprints on the ceiling, walking toward the nursery. The wood of the nursery door began to blister from the inside, as if exposed to steam or breath. The boards held, but the paint peeled in long vertical strips, revealing a reddish undercoat no one remembered applying. Annabelle demanded it be repainted, but every attempt failed. The brush would dry mid-stroke, or the paint would refuse to adhere. Dr. Alden attempted to apply holy water, gifted to him anonymously in a brown bottle with no label, but the moment the liquid touched the wood, it evaporated into smoke. Clara's behavior grew stranger still. She began drawing with both hands, creating mirrored images of rooms no one had seen before, chambers lined with tongues, staircases made of teeth, and windows that looked into other windows. When asked what they were, she answered, "Places will go when she finishes her mouth." One drawing depicted the nursery from above, as if seen through the ceiling, and in the center sat the faceless wooden doll, but now it had grown arms, long, jointless arms that extended into the floor. Alden burned that drawing and later found the ashes had reformed into a spiral. The next morning, the family cook left a note that read, "The house here's better now," and walked barefoot into the woods behind the property, never to return. Annabelle begged Alden to consider sedation, perhaps removing Clara to an asylum in Richmond, but he shook his head and said, "There's no more Clara. Not all of her." The following night, the knocking ceased, replaced by a low humming that came from the baseboards and lasted until dawn. Alden placed a stethoscope to the walls and heard 2 voices, one low and guttural, the other high and childlike, speaking in unison. He could not understand the words, but he felt them. They made his fingers twitch. On June 6th, the boards over the nursery door split in 3 places, though none had broken through. The damage was on the inside. Beneath one of the cracks, they found a wet handprint, small, child-sized, but with too many fingers. Dr. Alden no longer slept. He stayed in the study, transcribing the folio and comparing Clara's phrases to the strange notations inside. He discovered a repeated pattern, the name Selitha written backward, sometimes fragmented, sometimes nested within other words. He circled one phrase over and over. "She is not summoned. She remembers." By June 10th, Clara had stopped speaking entirely, communicating only by pointing or humming. She took to sleeping beneath her bed, saying, "She looks under the blankets now." Alden began to write less in his journal and more on the walls of his temporary room. Symbols, sigils, equations, desperate attempts to map the logic of the house, to chart what he called the infection of space. He believed the ceiling of the nursery had not contained the presence, but taught it to move differently. It was no longer centralized, it had become the architecture. Doors opened into different rooms depending on who entered. Mirrors showed guests arriving hours before they did. The house had become anticipatory, responding to fear like a predator testing its prey. Annabelle, once composed and orderly, began rearranging furniture compulsively, claiming she remembers where things were. On June 11th, the ceiling of the nursery collapsed inward with a sound like wet paper tearing. The sealed door held, but dust poured from the upper crack, and in it, black feathers and teeth were found. Clara drew that moment before it happened, handing Alden the paper as the first rumbles began. The drawing had no figures, only the door cracked open and a word scratched over and over across the floorboards. Soon, that night, for the first time since the sealing, the entire household heard the voice, not in whispers, but clear and full, a woman's voice, humming the same tune Clara had murmured in sleep, followed by a child's laughter and a single word, stretched and distorted as if spoken through deep water, hungry. Alden wrote nothing else that night. Instead, he sat outside beneath the dead tree behind the stables, clutching the folio, and said aloud, "We have not sealed it. We have only taught it to chew with its mouth closed." It was on the morning of June 14th, beneath a heavy sky that threatened rain but never delivered it, that Dr. Alden, now gaunt and sleepless, coaxed the truth from the Marlowe children, not through interrogation, but through silence, a silence that had grown so thick in the manor it felt like something to be peeled away. In the parlor, lit only by the gray light of the overcast window, he sat across from young Everett Marlowe, Clara's older brother by 3 years. His hands clutched tight around a feather he refused to let go. The boy had been silent for days, but that morning, while Annabel prepared tea and Clara sat catatonic near the hearth, Everett leaned in and said, "We made a pact with her. We weren't supposed to talk." When asked who her was, Everett did not look at his sister, nor at the nursery. He looked toward the floor beneath his feet. Alden recorded the conversation later that night, his hands trembling as he wrote, describing the boy's confession in stark detail. How 1 month before the fever started, the 3 Marlowe children had found a dead blackbird in the woods near the boundary stones. How Clara had insisted they bury it near the old well with its eyes facing east. How that same night, they heard tapping on the nursery wall, and a lullaby that none of them had ever been taught. Everett said the voice had spoken to them, not with words, but in pictures that appeared in their dreams and in the frost on their windows. The voice promised protection from their father's return, though he had been buried 3 years prior. The pact, as Everett called it, was simple. Feed her silence, feed her names. Each child was to offer a memory, a word they would never speak again, and in return, the presents would remain only in the nursery. Everett gave her the name of the cousin who died in infancy. Clara, trembling and hesitant, gave her the name of her doll, Rosewood. The third offering, Everett claimed, came from someone who had not been present but was listening from the wall. A fourth name they never knew, given in a whisper by the house itself. After the pact was made, they had sealed it with blood. Everett showed a faded scar along his wrist, a wound shaped like a crescent. Clara had made hers on her lip. The third child, the youngest, Ellen, was never mentioned again in public. Her name struck from family records, her belongings removed. Everett finally said it, barely above a whisper. She was the one who opened the door before we were told. Alden, stunned, realized what had long been hidden. There had been a fourth child, long forgotten or deliberately erased. A girl who had broken the rules of the pact, and in doing so had been taken. He inquired further, but Everett would not speak again that day. Annabel, when confronted, stood in silence for nearly a minute before finally saying, Ellen wasn't strong. She told her name in her sleep. That night, Alden reviewed his notes and journal entries and found subtle omissions in the family's history. Missing dates, gaps in the estate's generational chart, portraits taken down without explanation. The house had not just swallowed Ellen. It had digested her memory, turned her into a sealed room and a half-remembered sigh. Clara, now completely nonverbal except in drawings and humming, began sketching crows. Dozens of them, always circling a faceless child standing in a doorway. Alden found one drawing folded into his medical bag, though no one admitted placing it there. He attempted to analyze the terms of the so-called pact by referencing text in the folio, which had begun to bleed ink across its margins, literal smears of red appearing without explanation, as if the words themselves were leaking. In one corner of a page, he found the phrase, "The mouth that forgets the name remembers the hunger." The house, he came to believe, had not only become haunted by a presence, it had become complicit in its rituals, a structure that absorbed intent and converted it into ritual architecture. On June 16th, Everett awoke screaming, his hand bleeding from a wound shaped like a beak. He claimed the blackbird had visited him again, alive and silent, and pecked the word Ellen into his palm. That same day, the weather vane atop the house was found twisted backward, despite no wind, and 3 birds, real ones, were discovered dead in the nursery hallway, placed in a perfect triangle with their heads removed. Alden pressed Annabel for more. She finally admitted that their father had believed in ancestral partitions, spaces within a home where memory could be stored and silenced. He had called it heritage quietude, and written fragments about it in the margins of his law texts. She remembered him muttering that every house needs a room that cannot hear. It had started with a nursery, then the attic, then the basement sealed in 1812. She had always assumed it was eccentricity, grief-driven madness after their mother passed. But now she wasn't so sure. Clara began walking the halls at night again, whispering to walls, laying bird feathers beneath doorknobs, and one evening, she stood at the base of the stairs and said, in a voice not hers, Ellen was the first key. The rest are still locked. You can't burn a name, only bury it under more. Alden wrote that phrase over and over in his journal, until the ink bled through. The following morning, the children's toy chest was found opened, and inside was a tooth, not a child's, but fully grown, rooted, and clean. Wrapped around, it was a strip of cloth bearing the faded embroidery of the name Ellen. The Blackbird Pact, it seemed, was never broken. It was fulfilled, and the cost was silence, secrecy, and ritualized forgetting. That afternoon, Annabelle began burning the family albums, one by one, page by page. She said only, if she remembers too much, she'll need new mouths. Alden, growing desperate, sent another letter to Richmond, begging for spiritual intervention, medical assessment, anything. But the house intercepted it. He found the letter torn to shreds in the fireplace, though he never placed it there. That night, a storm broke over Grayson Hill for the first time in weeks, and the lightning revealed something painted beneath the nursery window, an old symbol, circular, with a bird pierced by a needle. The same symbol that had arrived months ago on the crate's wax seal. And beneath it, freshly scrawled in what Alden believed to be blood, were three words, We remember Ellen. On the night of June 22, 1834, the Marlowes sent for a midwife, though no one in town could say why, and no visible signs of pregnancy had ever been noted among the household. The messenger boy, barefoot and pale, knocked on the door of widow Elsbeth Kinley just before midnight and delivered no message other than, they said it's time again. Elsbeth, a woman who had helped birth more than 60 children across 2 counties, and who was known for neither superstition nor softness, dressed without question and followed the boy to Grayson Hill. She arrived shortly after 1 in the morning, and the staff met her with hollow faces and trembling hands. Dr. Alden would later write in his journal that Elsbeth seemed confused even before entering, glancing repeatedly behind her as though expecting someone to follow. The house was dimly lit with candles placed low to the ground, and the parlor had been cleared of furniture except for a single chair facing the fireplace. There was no warmth, no smell of food or comfort, only the sour scent of old copper and wilted roses. Elsbeth was led upstairs, not to a birthing chamber, but to the second-floor hallway just outside the nursery door, where the walls pulsed faintly beneath the candlelight as if breathing. Annabelle met her there with no explanation, merely pointed to the floorboards near the north window and said, "That's where it's going to happen." The midwife, bewildered, protested that no preparations had been made, no linens, no hot water, no instruments, but Annabelle only said, "She doesn't need those. She's not a mother like us." At that moment, a sound issued from beneath the floor, soft and rhythmic, wet, like the turning of pages soaked in oil. Elsbeth paused, her eyes narrowing, and then, as though compelled by something not spoken aloud, knelt and placed her hands to the wooden planks. Dr. Alden observed from a distance, too afraid to intervene, his own notes later revealing that he saw Elsbeth's eyes roll back in her head the moment her fingers touched the floor. A groan escaped from beneath the nursery wall, low, guttural, almost human, and then the candles all extinguished at once. What followed remains uncertain, for no one else entered the hallway during the next 3 days. When Elsbeth emerged, barefoot and blood-stained, her apron missing, her mouth sewn shut with what appeared to be her own hair, she walked calmly down the stairs, past the stunned household, and out into the dawn. Clara, who had been catatonic for over a week, stood as the midwife passed and whispered. She delivered the silence now. Elsbeth never spoke again. When Dr. Alden found her days later, seated in the rocking chair of her cottage, she was humming. No tune, just a steady exhale of breath, like wind through reeds. He tried to speak with her, to coax her into writing, but she only stared at the hearth and rocked. Her house was different now, every mirror gone, every window covered in black cloth, and small piles of salt in every corner. Alden noted in his journal that she had scratched symbols into the wood of her table, sigils matching those found in the folio, some newer, some older than any reference he could locate. A neighbor later reported that they had seen Elsbeth standing in her garden at midnight, holding a birdcage with no bird inside, whispering, "She's learning to fly with other mouths now." Back at the Marlowe estate, Clara resumed drawing with sudden vigor. Her pictures now depicted tunnels beneath the house, winding paths lined with eyes and mouths, and doors that opened to smaller doors. One drawing showed the midwife's hands reaching through a trapdoor into a darkened nursery, her fingers holding something wrapped in cloth, but instead of a baby, it was a rolled parchment marked with the word "hush." Dr. Alden burned that drawing, but Clara recreated it the next day, adding a detail. The parchment now unfurled to reveal a map of the house, but distorted, as though the layout had grown teeth and sinew. Annabelle, when questioned about the midwife, became evasive. "We needed someone who remembered pain," she said. She was the last in the line who still knew what the old women said about the mouth in the wood. Alden pressed her, demanded clarity, but she simply handed him a lock of gray hair and walked away. That hair, later compared by Alden to a sample taken from Elsbeth's brush, was an exact match. And yet, it had been braided with red thread, another symbol found throughout the manor's darkest corners. Over the next week, birds began circling the estate, not in pairs, but alone, one at a time, always black, always silent, tapping at the windows and disappearing before anyone could follow. Dr. Alden, spiraling now into obsession, returned to the spot where the midwife had knelt and began removing floorboards. Beneath them, he found earth, dark, damp, and warm, as though something living had been buried shallow. He dug with his hands, frantic, until his fingers touched cloth. He pulled up a bundle, no larger than a shoebox, wrapped in rotted muslin. Inside was a doll with no face, its mouth crudely stitched shut, and in its chest cavity, hollowed out, was a nesting of feathers, bones, and a single human molar. Alden nearly collapsed. He carried the object to his quarters and locked it away, but each night thereafter, he heard the sound of sewing, tight, quick threads pulled through skin. Clara began mimicking the sound with her lips, even as she slept. The house grew heavier, its halls sagging like a body burdened by secrets. The nursery door remained sealed, but Alden believed the ritual had moved beneath it, into the blood and bone of the estate itself. He wrote, "The delivery was not of flesh, but of function. The midwife was the instrument. What she helped birth was hunger with a name." Days later, Elsbeth Kinley's house was found empty. No signs of struggle, no indication of departure, only a single message scratched into the mirror frame above her fireplace. One final sentence, carved deep into the wood. "I heard her heartbeat in the floorboards, and I answered it." Alden never returned to the cottage. He told no one what he suspected, that the house had needed a vessel to stitch the mouth closed just long enough to learn how to speak again. And now, the silence had been unsealed, not broken, but birthed. A silence with purpose. A silence that listened back. The first to notice the change in the portrait was Everett, who on the morning of June 28 stood before the grand canvas that hung above the hearth in the Marlowe estate central parlor and asked, almost absently, why his father's smile looked crooked. The portrait in question had hung in that room for over a decade, an oil rendering of Judge Thaddeus Marlowe with his children seated beside him. Annabelle upright and proud, Everett with one hand gripping a toy soldier, and Clara nestled on her mother's lap, though her eyes had always seemed slightly too large for her face. It was, to most, a warm image of a once revered patriarch and his legacy. But now the colors had shifted. What once had been soft browns and golds had darkened into grayish umber, and Judge Marlowe's eyes appeared glosser, deeper, almost wet. Clara, upon seeing the portrait that evening, turned to Alden and said, "She's painting it from the inside." Over the following days, the portrait changed subtly but undeniably, as if time inside the canvas moved differently. The background grew darker, the details more warped. Everett's toy soldier began to blur at the edges. Annabelle's blouse developed stains that looked like mold, and Clara's face, uniquely, remained untouched, pristine, frozen in an almost angelic glow while all others decayed around her. Dr. Alden attempted to study the painting under magnification, but found that every inspection yielded different results. One day, the judge's hand rested gently on Annabelle's shoulder. The next, his fingers curled slightly, pressing harder. And on the third, his hand hovered inches above, as though unsure whether to return. A sense of movement pervaded the canvas, not animate like a haunting, but like watching an infection spread beneath skin. The artist who had painted it, Alden discovered through town records, had died 2 weeks after completing the commission, reportedly raving about unquiet colors and brushes that bled. Clara began spending more time in front of the portrait, sometimes whispering to it, other times humming that same impossible melody that no one else could place. When asked what she saw, she answered, "It's not a picture. It's a promise." Annabelle, now visibly aged beyond her years, took to covering the painting with a cloth at night, only to find it uncovered each morning, the frame warm to the touch, the canvas slightly vibrating. Alden began logging the changes in his journal, attempting to chronicle the portrait's progression. He described the way Everett's figure started to fade, his outline softening, until one morning his entire image appeared translucent, while Clara's expression had deepened into a half-smile, her hands now holding something that hadn't been the original, what looked like a small figure wrapped in cloth, faceless and limp. The distortion spread outward from the center, corrupting the outer figures and objects, leaving only Clara's form intact and untouched. Theories emerged, whisper in the halls. Some believed the portrait was being consumed, others that it was becoming more accurate to a reality no one wished to confront. Everett began to complain of pain in his reflection, saying mirrors made his skin itch and his voice sound wrong. On July 1st, he smashed the small mirror in his room and claimed it had shown him blinking a second too late. That night, the portrait changed again. This time, Everett's image was entirely gone. A faint outline remained, like dust left behind after an object is removed. Clara merely said, "He broke his part of the pact." The next morning, Everett was gone. His bed untouched, no signs of struggle, only a smear of black dust across the sheets and a single feather on the floor. Alden searched the house, attic to cellar, but found nothing. The house remained silent, pulsing. In the portrait, Clara's eyes were now looking outward. For the first time, she was no longer gazing at the painter or the judge. She was looking directly at the viewer. Alden covered the painting again, nailed the cloth to the wall, but the next day the nails had melted into the wood and the cloth lay folded on the mantel. The painting had begun to exude a scent, faint, metallic, almost sweet, like rust mixed with overripe fruit. Visitors refused to look at it. One servant vomited upon glimpsing it in passing. When Alden invited a local priest to bless the house, the man stood before the portrait for less than a minute before backing away, whispering, "She's watching from behind the eyes." He left without performing a rite, and that evening, the chapel bell rang twice at midnight, though no one pulled the rope. Clara began drawing the portrait in miniature, dozens of times, each one more distorted than the last, until in one drawing only the frame remained, filled with a mirror where her face should be. Alden's journal became increasingly erratic, scribbled notes about paint that breathes, frames as mouths, oil as blood substitute, and most chilling of all, this is not a portrait. It's a window, and something is almost done climbing through. On July 3rd, a storm struck the hill, and lightning cracked the parlor window. In the momentary flash, Alden, who had been dozing in a chair, swore he saw someone step out of the portrait and into the room, not through paint, but through the air around it, like a figure from memory pressed forward into flesh. He woke with blood on his palms and no wound. Clara said only, "The frame's edges are soft now. She can bend through." Annabelle wept that night alone in the kitchen and whispered to no one. It was supposed to keep him with us, not open the rest of them. When Alden tried to confront her about the commission, about what the judge may have done, she refused to answer, instead handing him the original receipt, signed not by the painter, but by someone named simply Ione. The ink was fresh. The final change came on the morning of July 5th. The portrait was gone. The frame remained, hanging empty, the nails still in the wall. On the floor beneath it, a puddle of oil, thick, black, and slowly swirling. Clara dipped her fingers in it and whispered, "She's through." And when Alden asked who she meant, Clara smiled, touched the center of his chest, and said, "You'll know her by your shadow." That night, the house did not breathe. It watched. The scratching began faintly on the night of July 6th, just hours after the portrait vanished, soft like the sound of a glove dragged across wood, persistent but unhurried, as though the thing making it had no need to rush, and the sound came not from behind the nursery door or within the walls, but from the ceiling itself, specifically the attic, long sealed by the judge after what had only ever been called the incident with the servant boy. For years it had remained locked, the key discarded, and the Marlowes had spoken of it only in oblique reference, calling it the hollow floor or the place above knowing. Yet now the sounds grew louder with each passing night. Rhythmic scuttling, nails against beams, occasionally punctuated by thuds, as if something inside were learning the weight of its own body. Dr. Alden, already exhausted and fraying at the edges of reason, noted in his journal that the attic was no longer an absence but a participant, and theorized that the energy once confined to the nursery had migrated upward, not escaped, but risen, as if following some ascending rite. Clara confirmed this, unprompted, when she whispered during breakfast, "She wants more room to crawl." The next night, a cold draft blew down through the house, despite closed windows and warm weather, and with it came a scent Alden had begun to dread and rot and sweet smoke. Annabelle, fearful but resolved, retrieved her father's old ledger from the library, the one he kept locked in the cabinet behind the bust of Cicero, and inside it they found blueprints of the house that included a version of the attic far larger than they remembered, with markings and notations that made no architectural sense, circles within rooms, staircases that turned into arrows, a symbol repeated in every corner, an open mouth with 3 dots inside. Alden copied the symbols into his journal, next to the blackbird seal and the word Celitha, noting how they seemed to correspond with the timing of the scratches, which now came every 4 hours, precisely like a heartbeat slowed to ritual. On July 9th, the attic door rattled in its frame, waking the entire household. When they investigated, they found fresh gouges around a lock and black dust beneath the crack of the door. Clara stood at the top of the stairs and said, "She's got her knees now." Dr. Alden began hearing sounds during the day as well, dragging, moaning, whispers that came from above even when standing outside the house. Birds no longer landed on the roof. One morning, he found a nest that had fallen from the eaves, its contents empty except for 4 smooth teeth and a small piece of parchment scrawled with the phrase, "No exit above." The attic was becoming a mind, Alden concluded, expanding, experimenting, rehearsing its voice in timber and dust. At Annabelle's suggestion, he brought tools to force entry, but each attempt failed. Crowbars bent, nails seemed to vanish from their containers, and once a hammer split in half mid-swing. The house was protecting the attic, or the thing inside it was. That same day, a mason named Bram was hired to inspect the beams from the outside. He climbed to the roof, glanced once at the central window of the attic, and fell without a sound. He survived the fall, but never spoke again. His hands, when unwrapped in the infirmary, were shredded as though he'd grasped something made of wire and bone. The attic window, long boarded up, was found ajar that evening. No one admitted opening it. Clara drew it over and over, each time darker, until the final drawing showed not glass, but an eye staring out, wide and vertical, not human. Alden kept that drawing. He began sleeping in a hallway outside the attic, documenting every sound, every vibration, marking their occurrence in 5-minute increments. The noises began to mimic other sounds. Annabelle's voice, his own mother's lullaby, the sound of rain though the sky was clear. On July 12th, he reported hearing his own footsteps above him while he lay still. The next morning, the scratches spelled out a word on the attic door, Alden, burned into the wood. That day, he found every page of his medical journal rewritten in his own handwriting, but none of the entries were ones he had written. They described events that had not yet occurred, predictions of conversations, and worst of all, a date, July 16th, Alden enters the mouth. He stopped writing for a day. The sounds became more aggressive. The house groaned like a ship in storm. Paint peeled from the ceiling. Clara's eyes rolled back for hours at a time, during which she spoke fluently in a dialect no one could identify. Annabelle wept, unable to explain what was happening, saying only, "He opened it once before Mother died." Something climbed back down with him. On July 14th, black feathers began appearing under pillows and boots, between the pages of books. Alden's own shoes were filled with bird bones. The attic door bled sap. And on the evening of July 15th, the sound stopped. Total silence fell, not only upstairs, but through the whole house. No creaks, no wind, no insects outside. Clara smiled. "She's standing now," she said. That night, Alden wrote what would be his last full journal entry. The attic was not forgotten. It was quarantined. The judge locked it for a reason, not to trap something inside, but to trap us beneath it. It is the head, the crown of the house, and we are the throat. The voice begins in the dark, but its echo. We are the echo. He did not sleep. The morning of July 16th, the attic door was found wide open. Inside, nothing was visible at first, just dust and stillness. But when Alden stepped in, he felt the boards breathe beneath his feet, and a shape move in the farthest corner, not walking, not crawling, but rising, like a figure unfolding from a crack in the world. Annabelle called out to him, but he didn't turn. He took a single step deeper into the attic and vanished from sight. The door slammed shut behind him. Clara placed a finger to her lips and whispered, "Shoo, she's learning how to speak through him now." The hearth in the Marlowe study had not been lit in nearly a month, its grate clogged with ash and feathers, and yet on the morning of July 17th, a faint flicker of flame glowed in its depths as Annabelle stepped into the room, drawn by a smell she could not place, neither smoke nor wood, but something closer to parchment singe around the edges, like burnt messages or skin once used for writing. When she approached, she saw that the fire was not consuming logs, but rather sheets of paper curled around themselves in slow-motion combustion, ink blurring across their surface but not vanishing entirely. She reached for the poker to stir them out, but as she did, one of the papers uncurled on its own, revealing handwriting, familiar type, slanted to the left. It was Dr. Alden's. She pulled the page free, and blew away the ash. What she read chilled her to her bones. I saw her tongue uncoil from the beams. Beneath it, more words, half fused to the scorched surface. She makes memory from marrow. The rest was lost, edges crumbling as she turned it. But there were more. As she sifted through the ash, she found half a dozen fragments, some still smoldering, others cold and dry, and all written in Alden's hand, but they spoke of things that hadn't yet occurred. One note described Everett standing in the garden with black veins across his chest, though Everett had vanished 5 days prior. Another bore only the word feed, repeated in a spiral. At the very bottom of the grate was a folded envelope, miraculously untouched by fire, sealed with wax, though not the blackbird's sigil this time, but something new, a single eye with teeth beneath it. Inside was a letter addressed not to Annabelle or Clara, but to she who remembers before the house had walls. There was no signature, but the handwriting matched the rest. That day, the flames refused to die. No matter how much water was poured into the hearth, the fire only dimmed, never extinguished. By evening, it began burning not upward, but inward, folding the logs into themselves, producing no smoke and casting a strange shadow on the wall opposite. That shadow did not match the flicker of the fire. It moved of its own accord. Annabelle, unable to bear it, covered the fireplace with a large cloth, but the next morning it had burned away, and in its place was a new message scorched into the brick. You cannot burn what she has already spoken. That night, Clara brought Annabelle a bundle wrapped in linen, letters, dozens of them, some clearly old, some appearing freshly inked, though no one could say who wrote them. Each letter was addressed to a different name: Thomas, Elsbeth, Everett, even Dr. Enoch Fry, Alden's colleague in Richmond. But all shared the same sender, the mouth below. The content of the letters varied. Some were warnings, others confessions, a few riddles that made no coherent sense. One contained a diagram of the manor, but inverted, showing rooms where there were none, and a long spiral staircase in the center labeled the tongue's root. The letters were written in a mix of languages, English, Latin, something that resembled Old Norse, and a script that Clara claimed she dreamed into paper. Annabelle kept the letters in the desk drawer, but every night they rearranged themselves into a new order. One morning, the entire stack was found pinned to the ceiling above the fireplace. The wax seals melted into strange symbols, each sheet now bearing a single phrase: "She has begun translating the marrow." On July 20th, the flames turned blue. That same day, the mirror above the fireplace cracked not from heat, but inward, as if something inside the wall behind it had pressed forward. Clara began speaking again, but only while asleep, reciting fragments of the letters word for word, including lines she had never been shown. She claimed she was only reading what's under the flames. Alden's journal, found beneath a loose floorboard that same day, contained its final written words: "The fire is not burning. It is remembering." From that point on, no one in the house referred to the hearth as a fireplace. It became the archive, a name whispered as if it might overhear. On July 21st, the fire produced no more light but pulsed in rhythm, like a heart, a soft, glowing beat that dimmed and brightened every 10 seconds. Clara counted the pulses and said they matched her dreams exactly. The next evening, the letters vanished. All of them. Gone from the desk, the drawer, the ceiling. In their place was a single sheet of human skin, stretched and nailed to the back of the hearth, bearing a tattoo of the blackbird's sigil fused with a new eye and teeth seal. Beneath it, carved into the brick, "This is how she breathes now." Annabelle tried to leave the estate the next morning, but the road twisted back toward the manor 3 times. Each time she passed the same dead tree, she found a different object hanging from its lowest branch: a doll, a jawbone, her mother's broken brooch. By the 3rd circuit, she returned in tears, whispering, "She won't let us forget the fire is speaking." Clara, that night, began drawing the fireplace in stages, not as it was, but as if it were evolving. Each version showed it growing deeper, forming ribs, teeth along the edges, eventually becoming a throat with a tongue of letters curling from it. When asked what she was drawing, she answered, "She's almost done swallowing what we used to be." Annabelle burned the drawings. They returned the next morning, tucked into her pillowcase, redrawn in what looked like rust. On July 23rd, the hearth went completely dark. No flame, no heat, only a soft breath, audible, continuous, exhaling from the grate. That night, the air in the study grew cold, and the sound of pages flipping came from inside the fireplace, though no one was near. When Clara entered the room, the breath stopped. She leaned toward the grate and whispered, It's time to tell them the rest." Annabelle begged her to stop, but Clara only stared into the empty hearth and replied, "The house wrote the first letter. We just delivered it to ourselves." On the gray morning of July 24th, with the wind dead in the sky holding a heavy stillness like lungs refusing to exhale, Annabelle wandered alone to the edge of the Marlowe family cemetery, a plot of land fenced in with rusting iron, where crooked headstones leaned as if whispering secrets to one another, and the names of the dead had begun to fade, their etchings eroded by time, weather, and perhaps something more willful. It was Clara who had directed her there, uttering just one phrase after breakfast, eyes vacant, voice flat. "The one we buried never slept." The Marlowes were a family of stone and earth, their dead always kept close, beneath trees grown crooked and under moss-covered angels that no longer had faces. The graves were neat but shallow, lined in strange precision. Yet as Annabelle moved among them, she found a plot that did not belong. It was fresh, the dirt still loose, the grass not yet grown, and no marker stood upon it. She did not recall any burial. Neither did the staff, nor the villagers. And when Dr. Alden, returned from the attic but quieter, hollow-eyed and slow, joined her at the site, he too confirmed no entry in the death ledger. Yet the grave was unmistakably there, sunken and too wide. They stood in silence for a long while before Alden retrieved a shovel, and without a word between them, they began to dig. It took longer than expected, the soil wet and clinging, and as they dug, the air around them grew colder, though the sun pressed hard from above. The shovel struck something solid at just over 4 feet. Not a coffin, but a box, wooden, dark, bound with iron and stained. They hoisted it from the ground and pried it open, and what they found inside was not a body, but a crude effigy, a wooden doll wrapped in faded linen, its mouth sewn shut with twine, its eyes replaced by polished obsidian stones. Its chest was hollowed out, and within it rested a folded scrap of parchment and a tooth, yellowed, human, unmistakably adult. The parchment bore just one sentence, scrawled in childlike hand. "You buried the noise, not the name." Alden stepped back, nearly falling, as the air around them shifted, growing thick and metallic. The trees groaned as though from weight. Annabelle clutched the doll, shaking, as a sound like distant thunder rolled from beneath the earth, an echo from no storm, but from something deeper, a voice caught in soil. They reburied nothing. The box was taken back to the house and placed in the study, against Alden's protests, but Annabelle insisted. "If it's speaking, we have to listen," she said, as if remembering a rule long forgotten. That night, the fireplace began to breathe again. Clara did not sleep. She sat at the window and spoke in a voice that did not match her own. They put her down there so they wouldn't have to remember. Now she's remembering herself. The next morning, Alden reviewed the cemetery ledgers again and found an entry written in a different ink, dated 2 years prior, with no associated name. The line read, "Burial of placeholder, witnessed by T. Marlowe and Ione Caldwell." The name placeholder had been used before, but only in cases of unknown remains, usually soldiers or transients. But there had been no such burial on the estate grounds. That same day, Clara presented him with a new drawing, the cemetery viewed from above, with the graves arranged in a spiral rather than rows. At the center was a mouth. Around it, names written in ink so dark it had bled through the page. Annabelle, Everett, Clara, Elsbeth, Alden, and finally a name scratched out violently, but not well enough. Alden realized then that the grave they unearthed wasn't a memorial. It was a container. Not for remains, but for memory itself. A symbolic burial meant to silence the echoes of what had come before. Clara's drawings now focused solely on burial motifs. Figures lowering boxes into pits, hands sprouting from soil, and houses with roots instead of foundations, roots shaped like teeth. Annabelle began hearing sounds beneath her floor at night. Knocking, breathing, and sometimes music. A lullaby played slowly and wrong, like someone who had forgotten how notes were supposed to sound. The following morning, she found a letter slid beneath her door, sealed with the old blackbird wax. To bury a name is to admit it had power. To exhume it is to feed it. Alden panicked, attempted to destroy the box, setting it ablaze in the courtyard while Clara screamed from the upper window, shouting. She remembers fire. She learned from the letters. The flame flickered blue, then black, and refused to spread. When the box cooled, it bore no damage. Instead, new carvings had appeared on its sides, glyphs matching those found in the margins of the folio, ones Alden still hadn't translated, but had seen etched on the inside walls of the attic. That night, the storm struck the hill, lightning cleaving a branch from the tree nearest the grave. Where the branch landed, the soil cracked, revealing not a body, but another box. This one smaller, older, locked. Inside, when opened, was a child's shoe, half decayed, and beneath it, a note in Alden's handwriting, though he swore he had never written it. You buried her twice, but she was never yours to forget. He collapsed shortly after, fevered and delirious, muttering about names that teach the bones how to echo. Annabelle nursed him for 3 days, during which Clara spoke only once, leaning into her ear and saying, "You dug up her whisper. Now she's going to teach us how to scream." The box, the doll, the tooth, and the grave had all been part of the same act, a ritual of forgetting made physical. But the house remembered. The land remembered. And now that they had exhumed the silence, the house had begun speaking in graves. That same week, all the headstones lost their names. One morning, they were simply gone. No etching, no memory, just blank faces in stone. The trees around the cemetery leaned inward. The fence rusted at twice the speed. And in the earth, beneath the fresh grave, something beat like a slow, heavy drum. Alden recorded one final note on the subject before falling silent for days. "We thought the grave was empty, but the hollow was the mouth, and it has teeth." By the final days of July, the house had begun to rot from the inside, not in any visible way, but in a manner felt first through the nose and then through the bones, a change that came like sickness does, quietly at first, and then all at once. The scent arrived without warning, sharp, metallic, unmistakably blood-like, though no blood had been spilled, mingled with the tang of salt, the kind used to line thresholds or preserve the dead. It drifted through the halls like a second breath, lingering in bed sheets, clinging to the undersides of spoons, rising up from the drains and seeping in through the cracks of the nursery door, which no longer stayed quiet. The boards nailed across it had begun to warp, bending outward, pushed from within. At night, the scent grew stronger, thick enough to taste, coating the back of the throat until sleep was no longer possible. Clara seemed unaffected. She sat in corners tracing circles into the wood with her fingertips, singing softly in a language she could not know, her skin pale and dry, her eyes wide and reflecting light that was no longer there. Dr. Alden, once composed and empirical, began sweating through his sheets, dreaming of mouths without faces and bones wrapped in twine, and waking to find his medical kit rearranged, his ink bottles filled with brine. On July 28th, the first basin filled with red-tinged water. It happened in the washroom at dawn. No one had used it, yet the basin steamed faintly, and the water smelled of iron. Annabelle poured it out, only to find it refilled an hour later. Soon every sink, basin, and pitcher in the house held the same fluid, dark and syrupy, and impossible to drain. The well outside tasted of the sea. No rain had fallen, yet salt crusted the windows, and the garden wilted as if burned from beneath. Alden tasted a drop on his finger and recoiled, not because it was foul, but because it was familiar. He described it in his journal as the flavor of old fear, salted grief, copper memory. Annabelle attempted to flee with Clara, packing only what they could carry, but the carriage wheels cracked as they reached the end of the drive. The horses refused to move forward, their eyes wide and white, and when she turned to look back at the house, she swore the attic window was open again, the curtain moving, though no wind stirred. That night, Alden collapsed in the hallway, coughing blood and salt water. Clara stood above him, not alarmed, only curious, and said, "She's rinsing you out so you can echo better." His lips blistered. He bled from the ears. And still he wrote. He documented how the scent followed him, how it grew stronger in places with no doors, how it whispered as it passed. He began carrying candles dipped in black wax, saying they burned slower and kept the mouth at bay. But the flames danced sideways. They flickered even when the air was still. On July 30th, the family cat was found drowned in the library, though no water was present. Its fur was soaked, eyes bloated, mouth stuffed with coarse salt. Clara said she didn't like the noise it made. That evening, all food spoiled in an instant. Meat turned gray, bread molded black, milk curdled and wept blood. The house refused to feed them anything but itself. Clara no longer ate. She pressed salt into her gums until they bled, whispering that it made her closer to the floor. Annabelle burned herbs in every room, but the scent persisted. It became a presence more than a smell, thick, sentient, pressing. At its strongest, people felt faint, dizzy, as if memory itself had been pickled. Alden theorized the house was preparing them for a transformation, that the salt and iron were precursors to internal calcification, As he called it, the process by which bone becomes memory and blood becomes instruction. He wrote these words with a trembling hand and crossed them out 3 times before letting them stand. On July 31st, the storm came, not of rain, but of wind and scent. The sky blackened without thunder, and the windows wept condensation made of brine. In the center of the foyer, puddle formed despite the sealed roof. When Alden stepped into it barefoot, he found teeth beneath the surface, 7 small molars arranged in a circle. Clara stood at the top of the stairs and said, "She's cleansing the last of you now." That night, no one slept. The house groaned from every beam. The wallpaper peeled itself back to reveal old messages written beneath, names and dates, warnings, commands. Speak not, name not, pour salt before you walk. In the drawing room, Annabelle found an old oil painting of her mother warped with mold, the canvas bubbling like skin. In its center was a hole burned through, revealing the brick behind, and the scent emanated strongest there, iron and salt, heatless and endless. It was then Alden discovered the first floor beneath the floor, a space that should not exist, shallow and cramped but present. A crawl space lined with dried kelp, old feathers and bones, not human, not animal, something in between. The walls of that crawl space were wet with condensation, yet no water dripped. He stayed in that space for 3 hours, writing what he heard, voices, all female, layered in static breath, repeating the same phrase over and over. The salt is not yours. The iron is not rust. We are coming up. On the morning of August 1st, the scent vanished, gone in an instant. Every basin emptied, every mirror cleared. The sky turned bright. The garden looked untouched, but the damage had been done. No one trusted the peace. Clara stopped speaking entirely, her mouth sewn shut in her sleep by thread no one owned. Annabelle cried for hours. Alden walked barefoot into the orchard and whispered, "I hear her in the blood now." The house was clean, but it was not whole. The scent of iron and salt had not left, it had been taken in. It was inside them now. The ritual had moved from space to skin, from room to marrow. They were no longer in danger. They were becoming part of the voice. On the evening of August 2nd, Everett Marlowe returned to the estate as quietly as he had vanished, through the back orchard, barefoot, covered in dried mud and soot, eyes wide with a hollow gleam that made Annabelle drop the candle she held when she saw him. No one had seen the boy in nearly 2 weeks, and the last time he was spoken of had been in whispers and dreams, with Clara insisting he had been taught to move without a body. But there he was, standing in the kitchen doorway, holding something in his left hand wrapped in cloth and saying only, "I found it." Dr. Alden, still weak but lucid enough to speak in full sentences again, took the cloth from Everett and unwrapped it to find a thin iron spike, hand-forged and still warm, with what looked like a smear of something black and oily clinging to its point. Everett said nothing more until he was alone with Alden in the study. Then, in low, deliberate speech, he recounted what he remembered, waking up in the woods, but not the woods behind the house. The ones that aren't really there, the ones underneath, and being led by voices shaped like birdsong to a place he could not describe, only draw. He scratched the outline in charcoal on the study wall, a circle within a square, with branching lines like fingers, and in the center, a figure without feet but with arms that stretch in all directions. "It showed me where my shadow lives," he said. "It told me to kill it before it learned to open the rest of me." Alden pressed him for clarity, but Everett grew distressed and began chanting, "Shadows don't die unless you trick them. Shadows don't die unless you trick them." Later that night, Annabelle found Everett in his room, stripped to the waist and holding the spike in one hand and a shard of mirror in the other. He had drawn symbols across his chest in soot and blood. When she demanded to know what he was doing, he answered calmly, "It's not following me anymore. I cut it out." Behind him, on the wall, was his shadow, but it moved wrong. It pulsed slightly as if breathing, and its arms were just a bit too long. Annabelle screamed, but by the time Alden arrived, the shadow had returned to normal, though Everett's body bore new scratches, fresh and deep, in the shape of letters. That night, no one slept. Clara hummed all through the hallways, not walking, only standing still in various corners, and Everett stood by the window until dawn. At first light, the staffer remained, only 2 by now, found black ash in the foyer shaped like footprints. They led from the back orchard to Everett's room and stopped at the mirror, which had shattered overnight. In his journal, Alden wrote, "The boy is not possessed. He is partitioned." Something followed him back, but it could not attach. It made a home in what he left behind. That day, Everett refused to walk outside unless the sun was high. It doesn't like to be seen, he explained. If it gets tall, it can find more places to hide. He drew diagrams of the house again, but this time the rooms had shadows labeled and cataloged, his own in the north hall, Clara's behind the pantry door, Annabelle's in the guest closet, and Alden's still blooming beneath the library. When questioned, Everett said he had learned to tell them apart by their breathing. Mine always held its breath when I looked at it. Now it breathes on its own. That evening, the house grew colder. Not a drop in temperature, but a withdrawal of warmth, as though the walls were leaning inward, anticipating. Everett was found sleeping in the cellar, the spike clutched tight in one hand, his face turned toward the stone, whispering something in a steady rhythm. She taught me how to lie to it. She taught me how to lie to it. When Alden asked who, Everett did not answer. The next day, Annabelle discovered that her reflection blinked out of sync. She caught it once, in the corner of her vision, the mirror version of herself smiling before she did. The same day, Everett pointed to the fireplace and said, it tried to crawl out through her face. I made it stay. The hearth, now cold and silent, bore no signs of fire, but the ashes inside had reformed into the outline of a child curled into a ball. Alden concluded that the house had begun to record its own history through shadow play, that the echoes were no longer sounds or smells, but silhouettes, cast by things that hadn't happened yet but were going to. That night, Everett stood in the courtyard during a blood-orange sunset and drove the spike into the dirt at his feet, shouting, I am not my shape. I am not what follows. Clara screamed from the upstairs window, not in fear, but in mimicry, her mouth matching his syllables without making a sound. The ground trembled. The wind dropped dead. The orchard leaves turned black on their stems. For the next 3 days, Everett did not speak. When he did, his voice had changed, lower, heavier, like someone twice his age. Akilda was waiting, he said. I was supposed to hold it until she was ready, but I stabbed it before it could learn my breath. Alden checked the boy's pulse. It was irregular, thudding in odd rhythms. His shadow no longer aligned with his body unless he concentrated. Clara seemed drawn to him now, standing behind him at every opportunity, her fingers twitching when he spoke. On the 4th night, Everett handed Alden a new drawing, a figure without a shadow, surrounded by mouths. Beneath it, written in jagged script, were the words, shadows die slow. They rot in place. At sunrise, the mirror in the foyer shattered without cause, and its shards reflected images that weren't in the room. Candles arranged in spirals, doors nailed shut from the inside, and in one shard, Everett standing over his own body. The house had begun to remember what Everett had erased. The shadow he had killed was still alive, just disconnected, waiting, seeping into cracks, echoing behind others. It did not need him anymore. It had learned the shape of the house. Annabelle wept that morning, holding a piece of mirror and whispering, they don't leave. They spread. Alden wrote, the boy killed his shadow, yes. But it didn't bleed. It whispered. It waited. And now it's grown curious. The night of August 6th began like any other, darkness rolling gently over Grayson Hill, the wind brushing low through the orchard, but as the sun sank behind the tree line, something failed to arrive time. The clocks in the Marlowe estate, always prone to minor inconsistencies, all stopped simultaneously at 8:46 p.m., their hands frozen, the ticking silenced. The grandfather clock in the entry hall issued one final chime, then shuddered with a deep groan, its pendulum grinding to stillness. At first, no one noticed, but as the night stretched on, it became apparent that nothing was moving forward. The air felt heavy and unmoving, the fire refused to flicker, and the moon, hanging low in the sky, never shifted. The rooster did not crow. No stars blinked. Dr. Alden sat awake in his study, writing for hours only to glance at the mantel clock and find that the hands had not moved a single minute. He opened the journal and scrawled in frantic loops, the night is not passing. We are not inside of it, we are underneath it. Annabelle tried to light a lantern, but the flame stood motionless, hovering as if trapped in oil. Water held in pitchers did not ripple. Wind pressed against the windows but never howled. Clara stood in the doorway of her room for the entire night, silent and unmoving, her eyes never blinking. When spoken to, she responded with a whisper, "It's watching how we wait." As the hours failed to advance, the family began to feel their own rhythms fracture. Hunger came and left without reason. Annabelle bit into an apple and found it already rotten. Dr. Alden swore he had taken a breath only once in 20 minutes. His lungs didn't ache. Everett slept with his eyes open and woke screaming from dreams that hadn't happened yet. The house itself adjusted. Walls creaked without movement. Shadows no longer aligned with light sources, and all reflective surfaces grew dull, absorbing the room instead of bouncing it back. At one point, Alden reached for his reflection in a silver bowl and swore his hand passed into something colder than air. By what should have been midnight, every mirror in the house had fogged from within. In the parlor, a low hum began, not coming from any mouth, but from the floor itself, subtle at first, then louder, rising and falling like breath beneath the wood. Annabelle placed her ear to the plank and recoiled, claiming to hear whispers in her own voice repeating phrases she had never said. Everett began writing backwards, stating that forward didn't work here. The boy looked different, older, thinner, but unchanged in stature, as though time had drained color and not age. He claimed that the house was recording their waiting, learning their stillness, writing new rules into the walls. When Alden checked the folio, he found the ink had run upward across the pages. Margins that were once blank now bore handwritten annotations in a style identical to his own, though he had not made them. One line read, "Stillness is the key. Motion is betrayal." Outside, the night deepened but never ended. At some point, a dog barked once in the distance, but it sounded underwater. The windows turned dark and mirrored, showing not the outside world but the rooms behind them, empty even when someone stood in front. Clara finally moved at what would have been 3 a.m., if the clocks had worked, and walked barefoot into the drawing room, trailing a length of red thread from her fingers. She wound it around each doorknob, saying softly, "So she knows who stayed still." Annabelle followed her, trying to pull her back, but stopped when she entered the room and saw her own shadow on the wall, larger, stretched, but frozen mid-motion. When she moved, the shadow didn't. When she spoke, it turned its head. She left the room without saying a word. Alden discovered later that the thread Clara used matched the binding on the doll they had exhumed from the hollow grave. No one had retrieved it. It had returned to her on its own. At what should have been morning, birds remained silent. The air was still dark, but the lamps had begun to flicker as if in protest. Alden sat in his chair and watched the clock until he began to weep. "We are unmoored," he wrote, "not held by time, kept in place like a page between chapters. The house is reading us." Just before light should have returned, change came. Clara, now seated in the center of the main hallway, smiled and whispered, "She's done watching." The second she spoke those words, all light extinguished completely. Candles, lanterns, even the hearth, and the entire estate was plunged into pitch-black silence. No one breathed. No one moved. In that absolute darkness, the sound returned, not from any one direction, but from inside the bones of the house. A deep, gurgling exhale, and then a single word spoken in a voice that was all of theirs combined. "Now." At that instant, every candle flared back to life. The clocks spun violently, their hands circling until slamming back into place at dawn. The rooster crowed, the sky turned, and morning returned. But nothing felt new. The world had simply been resumed, not advanced. The night had not passed. It had been paused, replayed, absorbed. The house smelled faintly of ink and wet earth. All the walls were damp with condensation. Clara slept for the first time in days. Everett whispered in his sleep, "She copied us." Alden's journal now bore an extra page, perfectly pressed between two entries, with handwriting not his own. Time was offered. Time was tasted. You belong to the interval now. And as Annabelle stood at the window, staring out into the orchard where dawn slowly crept across the trees, she swore the sun didn't rise. It simply appeared, placed there like a prop. Nothing had changed, and everything had. On the morning of August 7th, Dr. Isaac Alden descended the staircase with steadiness he had not possessed in weeks, his gait measured and unnatural, as if each step had been practiced in advance, and when he reached the foyer, he placed his journal gently upon the floorboards as though it no longer belonged to him. He said nothing to Annabelle, who stood frozen near the banister, nor to Clara, who sat cross-legged in the drawing room, humming into a cracked porcelain teacup. He wore no shoes. His clothing was soaked to the bone, though there had been no rain. In his hand, he carried the folio, not clutched, but offered like a relic, and when he passed Everett on the porch, he paused, touched the boy's forehead lightly, and said, "She's listening with your breath now." Then he turned and walked away from the estate, barefoot and wordless, toward the hills beyond the orchard. He did not return that day. or the next. On the third morning, Annabelle entered his chambers and found the windows open, the floor littered with pages torn from the folio, each one folded into strange angular shapes, as if attempting to form mouths or wings. The journal he had left behind had been moved, now resting beneath the bed, wrapped in linen, sealed with wax made from candle drippings and something darker, something slick to the touch. Carved into the wood of his desk was a phrase she had seen before in one of the fire letters. A house cannot forget its keeper. That evening, a boy from the village arrived with a message. The doctor's body had been found at the bottom of his own well, slumped and bloated, hands folded neatly across his chest, mouth open in a silent scream. No sign of struggle. No one had seen him climb inside. When they pulled him out, the water was thick with salt, and in his clenched left fist was a single page torn from the folio, soaked but legible. It read, "She taught me to become a warning." His burial was quiet. Annabelle, Everett, and Clara stood alone at the grave. Clara placed a small stone wrapped in red thread atop the casket before it was lowered. Everett whispered something into the soil that no one else could hear. That night, Annabelle returned to the house and opened Alden's final journal. It was incomplete, with pages torn out and some rewritten in shaky, frantic loops. But one entry stood out, undated, scrawled across both sides of a single sheet. It read, "The house does not need walls to hold you. It needs only memory. Memory does not rot. It waits. It waits for vacancy, for silence. It waits for breath to pause, for thought to slow. I have seen her. I have spoken her name backwards into a mirror. It was not enough to stop her. Nothing stops what never learned to end. She is not haunting this place. She is curating it." He had drawn a symbol beneath the words, the mouth, the eye, the three dots, all bound in a spiral. Annabelle turned the page and found more fragments of diagrams, partial translations of the folio, and what appeared to be instructions, not on how to stop the entity, but how to avoid being used by it. One line repeated again and again. "The house cannot lie. It only listens. And then it remembers you." As the night deepened, the house grew louder. Not with sounds, but with presence. Doors no longer creaked, they sighed. Stairs no longer groaned, they responded. Clara stopped speaking altogether, though she continued to hum and occasionally placed drawings beneath doorways, images of Dr. Alden with his mouth sewn shut or with his hands replaced by inkwells. Everett began avoiding mirrors again. He claimed he saw the doctor in them, writing in rooms that no longer existed. On the fourth night after Alden's death, the fireplace lit itself. No fuel, no match, just sudden, deliberate flame. Inside the hearth, a journal page curled upward, revealing Alden's handwriting, blackened but intact. "I was not the first. I am only the one who wrote it down the loudest." The house had begun replaying his words, his presence, his influence, whispers in his voice, pages rewritten in his script, and even the sound of his cane tapping through the upper hallway, though he was buried miles away. Annabelle considered leaving again, but every attempt to gather her belongings ended with items missing or replaced, her suitcase filled with salt, her clothing soaked in brine, her shoes filled with bird bones. The house would not allow another exit. Not now. Not after absorbing Alden's silence. On August 10th, Clara walked into the study and placed a drawing on the desk. It was a portrait of the house, faceless, roofless, and bleeding from every window. Below it, written in block letters, was, "She wears the ones who write." That night, Annabelle lit every candle in the house, opened all the windows, and read the entire folio aloud. Clara listened. Everett slept. The house pulsed. And when the final page was turned, a soft knock came from the nursery. The boards across the door had begun to peel back, one by one, as if unfastening themselves. She did not open it. Instead, she returned to Alden's journal and wrote a single sentence. He tried to leave a warning. She read it louder than we did. She placed the book beneath the floorboards and sealed them with wax, her own breath trembling. The Marlowe house had taken the doctor's silence and made it doctrine. His memory lived in the air now, echoing in walls, flickering in the candlelight, waiting to speak again in the mouth of the next who dared to write. The warning had been left. But no one, not the village, not the church, not the doctors in Richmond, would read it in time, because the house already had. On the night of August 13th, precisely 9 days after Dr. Alden was laid in the earth and 3 days after Clara spoke her last word, a knock came at the door of the Marlowe estate. Not a visitor's knock, not frantic or hesitant, but 3 slow, deliberate taps, as though someone had been waiting for the right moment to announce their return. Annabelle, who had barely slept, approached the door with a lantern in hand, its flame dimmer than usual, casting little warmth. When she opened it, she found a young woman standing at the threshold, barefoot, her dress torn but clean, her hair matted with what looked like dust and cobweb, and her eyes the pale, unblinking shade of river fog. She did not introduce herself, but Annabelle knew who she was, knew without needing confirmation, without words, knew in the marrow of her bones. "Ellen," she whispered, though she hadn't spoken the name aloud in years. The girl did not nod. She merely stepped into the house and looked around like someone returning to a childhood home that had been rearranged by strangers. Everett came down the stairs slowly, gripping the banister with white knuckles. Clara emerged from the drawing room doorway, her face unreadable, and simply walked to the girl and held her hand. No one asked where she had been. The sealed child had returned, not as a ghost or as a memory, but as flesh, though what resided behind her eyes was not entirely human. Her skin was cold and paper-thin, pulsing slightly beneath the candlelight, and when she spoke, only once, it was in a voice layered with echoes, as though her throat had been trained in silence and was only now remembering how to form sound. "I found the mouth beneath the root," she said, and then nothing more. That night, there in the house became still again, like it had the night the clock stopped, but this stillness was different, expectant. The fire lit itself, but gave no heat. The mirrors fogged from within. Ellen stood in the hallway until dawn, not sleeping, not blinking, just watching. And when morning came, the entire house shifted, slightly but perceptibly, its timbers groaning like an old joint flexed after a long rest. Annabelle began searching for the old letters again, the ones that had disappeared after the fire, but instead found new pages slid beneath her door, written in an unfamiliar hand but sealed with wax in the shape of an open eye. Each letter described dreams she had never had, but which began to manifest that very night. Visions of long hallways without ends, of children with sewn mouths sitting in pews, of staircases that bent downward forever and echoed with weeping she could not place. Ellen did not eat. She did not speak. She walked the house as if it knew her, and she it, tracing her fingers across the wallpaper and pausing at certain spots to whisper into the plaster. Clara followed her, never asking questions, only humming as if mimicking the language Ellen brought with her. Everett claimed he saw her shadow move in a different direction than her body. At night, she stood before the sealed nursery door and breathed, slow and measured, and the boards would creak as if preparing to loosen. On the morning of August 15th, every basin filled again, this time with clear water, but at the bottom of each was a child's tooth. The air smelled like earth, freshly turned. In the attic, footprints appeared, bare, small, muddy, leading in circles that formed a spiral. Ellen's presence was not a return, it was a reactivation. Her sealed absence had been a placeholder, a missing limb the house had finally grown back. And with her arrival came new phenomena. Time once again drifted, not pausing, but skipping. Meals were forgotten mid-bite. Words began to repeat in conversations. Everett said he saw himself leaving the room before he stood to go. One of the remaining staff members, a stable hand who had stayed out of obligation, was found in the barn with his eyes sewn open and his lips filled with salt. He survived, but when questioned, he only muttered, "She came from the root." That night, Clara gave Ellen her old doll, the faceless one, its mouth unstitched. Ellen held it and pressed her lips to its forehead. The next morning, it was gone. No one spoke of it again. In her journal, Annabelle wrote, "Ellen has not returned. She has resumed. The sealed child was never meant to be buried, forgotten, or hidden. She was not taken. She was chosen to wait, and now the waiting had ended." In the following days, Ellen began to rearrange objects in the house. Picture frames turned inward, chairs stacked in corners, salt lines wiped clean, doors unlocked that had not been opened in decades. She walked into the nursery one night without resistance, the boards across the door having fallen in quiet surrender, and when she emerged, her hands were stained red and her eyes gleamed like glass. She said nothing. She needed to say nothing. The house began to echo her footsteps. Every time she moved, the creaks and groans of the boards aligned to match her rhythm, as if syncing with her will. Clara followed her always, and when she began to speak again, it was only in riddles. "We are learning to swallow backward. She is building a name from us. The rooms are remembering how we used to sound." Everett stopped speaking altogether. He drew only circles now. On August 17th, Annabelle opened the basement door and found it flooded, not with water, but with mirror glass, reflective and humming, and in each shard she saw a version of Ellen staring back at her, expressionless, multiplying with every blink. That night, Annabelle packed her belongings to leave once more, but when she opened the front door, she found the orchard gone. Not dead, not burned, gone. Replaced by a field of smooth gray soil stretching endlessly under a black sky where stars hung too close. Ellen stood behind her and said, "You're looking through the root." Annabelle turned, shaking, and found herself still inside the house. She had never opened the door. Her hands were empty. Ellen was not behind her. The moment had not happened. And yet she remembered it. The sealed child had returned, not to be saved, not to be healed, but to complete the voice that had once been silenced. Now it would speak in full. Sheriff Roland Pike was not a man known for superstition. A veteran of minor frontier skirmishes and a longtime lawman of Green Hollow County, he had built his career on practicality, quiet suspicion, and the kind of administrative diligence that makes a man forget his dreams. And yet, on the morning of August 20th, when he received an unsigned letter delivered in a wax-sealed envelope stained with salt water, he hesitated before opening it. The letter contained no greeting, no plea for help, only a single phrase written in shaking black ink. "They've opened the mouth again." Below it was a name, Marlowe. Pike read it twice before quietly locking his office door. The Marlowe family, while known in town for their affluence and reclusiveness, had long kept a respectful distance from official business. He processed their property deeds and dismissed their occasional noise complaints, but beyond that, he'd never set foot on Grayson Hill. There were rumors, of course, about the daughter that vanished, the strange old judge who never aged, the doctor who drowned in his own well, but Pike dealt in what could be filed. Still, he packed his satchel, loaded his revolver, and made the climb that afternoon. What he found when he arrived disturbed him enough to begin an official inquiry, but what he documented would never make it into the county archive. According to Pike's private notes, which were discovered decades later in a locked drawer hidden beneath a false panel in his desk, the house appeared intact upon arrival. No structural damage, he wrote. No signs of force. Yet the moment I stepped inside, I felt unwelcome in a way I've never known, a heaviness behind the eyes, a weight in my teeth. He was greeted by Annabelle, pale and disheveled, who led him not to a sitting room but to a wall. She said only, "He asked me to show you where the voices live." Then she stepped aside. The wall in question was in the back hallway, behind what should have been the linen closet. But when Sheriff Pike opened it, he found not shelves and towels, but a hollow crawl space lined with human hair pressed into the boards like insulation. A faint light flickered within. No candle, no source. Pike entered and found stacked within that narrow space a series of boxes labeled with names he recognized from old census records. Marlowe ancestors long presumed buried. Each box contained bones arranged ritualistically, wrapped in salt-stained cloth, and accompanied by scrolls of parchment written in a language that none of Pike's schooling could decipher. One scroll had been unwrapped recently, still damp at its edges. It depicted a diagram of the house with lines connecting every room to a central spiral marked only with the word tongue. Pike returned to the main hallway shaken. Clara sat nearby, humming into her hands. Ellen walked past without acknowledging him, her feet not quite touching the floor. Pike noted this in his private report, though he never spoke of it aloud. The girl moved like breath through a cracked window. He questioned Annabelle for 2 hours. She answered calmly, sometimes smiling, always courteous, but her answers rarely aligned. She claimed Dr. Alden had left months ago, that Everett had gone to school in Richmond, that Clara had never spoken before, that there was no one named Ellen in the family. But Pike had seen them all, heard their names in town records. He asked if she would allow a formal investigation. She nodded and said, "We've been waiting for someone to write it down again." He inspected the attic and noted that despite its locked hatch, the dust had been recently disturbed, footprints weaving in impossible patterns. In the parlor, he found old letters burned halfway through. The remaining sentences written in a cipher he could almost understand, English words bent backwards. One fragment read, "She will not echo. She will instruct." He interviewed the last surviving servant, a mute woman who handed him a folded paper written in pencil. It said, "The mirrors tell the truth late." That night, Pike returned to his office and began writing the report. He included all findings, diagrams, quotes, sketches of the sigils. It totaled 28 pages. He mailed a copy to the Richmond Bureau of Public Record. He made 5 copies for state distribution. Only one survived. 3 days later, officials from Richmond arrived to assess the property. They found the estate silent. Not abandoned, silent. No voices, no movement, no decay. The floors were clean, the furniture dusted, the beds made. But there was no sign of life. Only one item was found out of place: Sheriff Pike's badge, resting atop the hearth, with his revolver beneath it, both dustless. Pike was never seen again. The report was quietly removed from the Bureau's files. Those who read the initial pages resigned or transferred within the year. The official narrative became unspecified disappearance. The Marlowe estate was listed as vacant, but the house was never listed for sale. Locals claimed the building was leveled, but records of its demolition are non-existent. The land title remains active, held by a trust under a name that appears in no census or tax record. The copy of Pike's report that survived did so only because it was hidden, folded, and placed behind a church ledger by a clerk who later confessed on his deathbed that he'd seen something blink through the ink. That document ends with a final page written in a different hand, added later, signed only, "He came looking for truth and found transcription." She does not kill. She edits. The sheriff did leave a warning, just not one the system allowed. His words live now in margins, on tongues, in shadows. The house did not silence him. It published him. Long after the estate had been declared abandoned, long after Sheriff Pike vanished and Dr. Alden's warnings faded into hushed speculation, the records began to reappear, not in courtrooms or archives, but in bloodlines. In the years that followed the last known events at Grayson Hill, children were born in surrounding towns with oddities too specific to dismiss as coincidence: birthmarks shaped like spirals, aversions to mirrors, uncanny mimicry of voices they had never heard. In Glen Hollow, a girl named Marin spoke her first word at 3 months. It was Selitha. Her parents, school teachers, had never heard the name before. In Bird's Landing, a boy named Elias nailed his bedroom door shut at age 6 and claimed it was because the pact needed walls. These children, separated by miles and years, shared behaviors that defied logical explanation. They wrote backwards before learning to write forwards. They sang songs in their sleep in a language no adult could identify, and they drew pictures of houses with too many windows and trees with mouths. No medical cause was found, but each of their parents, upon researching their ancestry, discovered buried connections to the Marlowe family: cousins, great-aunts, forgotten marriages. All lines eventually traced back to the estate. These were the children of the pact, not just the literal offspring of those who had lived within the house's walls, but the inheritors of its memory. Whatever had been sealed with the Blackbird Oath had not ended with Clara, Everett, or Ellen. It had fractured into blood and time. The pact had never been a deal. It had been a seed. One child in particular, Jonah, born in 1852 in a parish outside Richmond, displayed disturbing knowledge of the events that had supposedly occurred 2 decades before his birth. At age 5, he carved a message into his bedroom wall. We were not supposed to speak her name during thunder. When asked who she was, he answered, "The one they buried with the teeth." Investigators dismissed the boy's claim until he began drawing the exact floor plan of the Marlowe estate, complete with secret stairwells and crawl spaces no longer public knowledge. His drawings matched diagrams found only in Pike's suppressed report. By 10, Jonah had become completely mute, choosing instead to communicate through glyphs later identified as identical to those in the Marlowe folio. He disappeared at 16. Left behind was a journal titled The Remembering House, filled with drawings of faceless dolls, birds nailed to doors, and children holding scrolls that whispered. The journal was quietly destroyed by local clergy, but the others remained. By 1881, reports from as far as Tennessee began circulating of children forming secret clubs where the only rule was silence. One town doctor noted that several young girls would sit in a circle around a doll, cutting its mouth open repeatedly and stitching it closed again, always saying, "She listens best when we pretend not to look." All of them, in time, were found to share some genealogical connection, however distant, to the original family. These children often vanished in adolescence, reappearing years later under different names, usually alone, often mute, always afraid of attics and nursery songs. In interviews, some of them described dreams where they were trapped in a house that blinked. Others said the house had a name, but they had forgotten how to spell it. A boy named Warren claimed his grandmother taught him the sleeping oath, a lullaby he sang backwards that kept the wet voice from climbing through his mirror. He drew the same symbol Alden had recorded: a spiral, a mouth, and 3 dots. These are not stories. These were recurrences. The Marlowe Pact had never ended because it was never about a single place. The house had not confined the presence. It had been its first language. The pact had simply taught it how to speak. And now, generations later, the pact had changed. It no longer required blood, only memory. And memory had become contagious. Church records in Virginia's lowlands were quietly amended, removing names connected to the Grayson line. One bishop insisted all mirrors be removed from baptism chambers after a girl interrupted a blessing to say, "She's already beneath the water." In schoolhouses, children refused to sing certain notes in music lessons, claiming the wrong tune would open the wall again. By 1900, a quiet but undeniable pattern had emerged. Those who descended from the Marlowes, or from those who entered the house, bore markers of something inherited, not physical, but narrative. They carried forward unfinished stories, replaying traumas that were not their own. Some never spoke at all. Others only whispered in their sleep. Clara's name appeared in scattered family Bibles, usually scratched out or replaced with C. The same was true for Ellen, though she more often appeared in letters, always described as the girl who left, then returned different. No one could trace Everett's final years, though one man, claiming to be his great-grandson, was found wandering the ruins of the estate in 1924, barefoot, teeth filed to points, holding a journal that contained only one phrase repeated. I watched her write the pact in my skin. He died in a sanitarium 2 weeks later, having swallowed every page of his own book. The pact had changed, yes, but it had not weakened. It had simply learned, adapted, hidden in memory, passed not through ritual now, but through silence and unspoken inheritance. The children were not cursed. They were castings, echoes of unfinished sentences spoken by a house that had never stopped speaking. A new child in Georgia began screaming at night whenever salt was brought near her. Another in Vermont was found nailing small wooden birds to her bedroom walls, saying, "She won't open her wings unless I tell her who we were." These children never met. They never read each other's words. But their drawings matched. Their phrases overlapped. The Blackbird Oath, fractured as it was, had spread. No one remembered the rules. But the house did. In the years following the final entries in Dr. Alden's journal and the unexplained disappearance of Sheriff Pike, the city of Richmond began receiving unusual requests from small towns scattered throughout the Appalachian region. Requests for psychiatric evaluations, religious intervention, and on more than one occasion, exorcisms cloaked in clinical terminology. The patients were almost always children or adolescents, though occasionally an elder would appear, muttering fractured nursery rhymes and clawing at their own tongues. Doctors at the Richmond State Hospital began documenting what they classified as Marlowe-associated psychosis, though the term never appeared in any published journal. Among themselves, they simply called it the whispering line. What distinguished these cases wasn't just the similarity in symptoms, obsession with silence, the drawing of spiral sigils, and recurring dreams of houses with sentient walls, but the consistency of language and symbols between individuals with no known contact. The doctors held private meetings where they exchanged sketches, testimonies, and even phonetic renditions of lullabies recovered from patient journals. These songs were often sung backward or in patterns that looped on themselves, leading several physicians to speculate the patients weren't speaking to themselves but to something listening beyond the clinical walls. By 1869, 6 of the institution's senior doctors had either resigned, left the state, or were found dead under circumstances labeled professionally induced suicide. Dr. Malcolm Tears, one of the first to catalog the symbols appearing in patient journals, was discovered inside his office, mirror shards embedded in his palms, his walls covered in messages written with his own blood that read, "It followed me home." His case was never reopened. One nurse who had attended many of these patients, a woman named Elsie Corrick, claimed the afflicted always paused before entering certain rooms, especially if the door was unpainted or the ceiling bore water damage. She said, "They know which walls have ears and which ones are mouths." When she was later institutionalized herself, she spoke only in whispers, refused all medication, and spent her final days drawing diagrams of a house with no doors, only windows facing inward. Several of the attending physicians attempted to systematize the patterns, assigning numbers to each recurring symbol, mapping correlations between dreams and genealogy, but the data never aligned cleanly. Every time they approached coherence, something unraveled, a page misplaced, a patient transferred without record, a file lost to unexplained fire. One by one, they stopped pursuing it. Not because they disbelieved the phenomenon, but because they began to feel it observing them back. Dr. Ellis Monroe, the last to maintain a formal log of the Marlowe cases, burned his own notes in 1883 and wrote only one final entry in the hospital ledger. We are not meant to interpret her, only to reflect her. After that, no doctor in Richmond would speak openly about the Marlowe bloodline or the house on Grayson Hill. Referrals stopped. Cases were redirected to distant institutions. The remaining patient files were sealed and moved to an underground archive, one that was quietly locked and left unstaffed. Rumors among younger staff persisted for decades. Stories of patients speaking languages no one could translate, of mirrors in the East Wing fogging without cause, of a child whose shadow moved independently and who insisted on being called mouthborn. When one intern attempted to reopen the Marlowe file in 1911, he found his access credentials revoked within the hour. 2 days later, he was transferred to a facility in Montana and never heard from again. The institution itself changed. Hallways were remodeled. Certain rooms were bricked up and painted over. No explanation was given, but some claimed the bricks were laid backward and that the workers refused to whistle or speak during construction. Former doctors, now aged and nearing retirement, were known to flinch at the mention of certain phrases: echo blood, salt thread, sleeping spiral. One, when interviewed for an unrelated medical journal, broke down mid-sentence and began reciting coordinates, which when plotted, formed the perimeter of the Marlowe estate. None of the original staff from the Alden era remained by 1920. All that survived was silence, and the quiet dread that silence was invited. In private, some surviving physicians confessed that they believed the house had never been a location but a form of cognition, an entity that had taught others how to structure memory as architecture, how to bind identity to language, and how to replicate itself through trauma. It did not haunt. It co-authored. It stitched new identities from old wounds and taught them to speak the language of foundation, of wallpaper, of stairwells that looped through time. And those doctors, many of whom had sworn oaths to reason and science, began to fear that every observation they made was simply feeding it, refining its grammar. By 1932, Marlowe became a banned term in all psychiatric correspondence within the Richmond institution. A new phrase replaced it: event inheritance syndrome. It was clinical, digestible, and vague enough to ignore. But the walls remembered. The padded rooms carried echoes that could not be traced. A nurse once joked that the tiles hummed at night, until she went deaf the following week. No one joked after that. The Richmond doctors did not forget the Marlowe case. They abandoned it like a man might abandon a ship that whispers his own secrets in the wind. They refused to speak not out of cowardice, but reverence. Because silence, they realized, was not absence. It was obedience. The house on Grayson Hill was never demolished. Despite the reports, despite the official statements of erosion and landslide, the house stood long after its blueprints were forgotten and its ownership obscured by legal fictions. It changed shape, subtly, then profoundly. Locals began referring to it not as the Marlowe House, but as the listening place. Some claimed it shrank with time, windows closing like eyes after dusk, hallways folding inward, rooflines sagging as though pressed down by an unseen hand. Others said it grew slowly, imperceptibly, adding rooms where there had been none, doors that led to mirrored versions of existing floors, staircases that ended in silent portraits that blinked. The house, they said, was no longer content to be visited. It wanted to be remembered. Over the decades, the structure began attracting those who did not belong anywhere else. Children who drew spirals in the dirt with their heels, vagrants who muttered prayers not found in any scripture, and strangers who arrived without names but spoke in sync, as if rehearsing something ancient and precise. They never stayed long. They claimed they were only there to deposit memories, and left quietly, often barefoot, always without turning their backs on the doorway. The land around had changed, too. Trees that once bordered the estate withered and reappeared on the opposite side. Birds avoided the sky above it. The soil refused to grow anything save for small, thorn vines that twisted into the shapes of mouths. Surveyors who attempted to map the property found their measurements corrupted, compasses spun, and aerial photographs developed with blurs where the house should be. One team reported seeing the same room from 3 different angles, none of which aligned, and their leader later claimed the house wasn't built, it was recited. By the 1940s, attempts to mark or chart the land were halted. The county stopped referencing the property altogether. And yet, people continued to arrive. Not many never en masse, but enough that a pattern could be observed. Writers with insomnia, architects with broken memories, children whose dreams described the soft voice under the stairs. They came with stories, always. Sometimes letters they never sent, sometimes objects wrapped in cloth, bones, dolls, teeth, scrolls, even photographs that melted under sunlight. They would leave these things on the porch or bury them in the orchard that no longer bore fruit. Then they'd leave, claiming something had been taken from them, but something else had been returned. The house did not haunt. It harvested. Not souls, not in the religious sense, but sentences, fragments of identity, echoes of loss. Its structure thrived on narrative imbalance, pulling in the unresolved and repurposing it into new architectural shapes. Each crack in its walls corresponded to a pause in someone's memory. Each door that refused to open mirrored a truth left unsaid. In time, the house no longer resembled a Victorian estate. It began to adopt features no human could have designed. Curved rooms with no light source. Windows that looked out only into other rooms. A spiral staircase that narrowed with each step until breath could no longer pass. And yet people still entered. Not to explore. Not to solve. But to surrender. Because the house had become a reliquary, not of objects, but of trajectories. It held what could not be kept elsewhere. The moments before death, the thoughts that could not be spoken, the rituals practiced in dreams but forgotten by morning. Inside, time was not linear. Visitors reported seeing themselves at younger ages. Some found letters they had never written, addressed in their own handwriting. Others claimed the mirrors whispered in voices they recognized but could not name. One visitor, a linguist who had studied ancient dialects, spent an hour inside and emerged unable to speak in any known language, but wrote fluently in glyphs found only in the Marlowe archives. He wept as he wrote, saying only, "I've been found." By 1971, the house was no longer recognized by local government. It had been removed from all maps. The land taxes ceased. No one claimed ownership. No one contested its erasure. But it remained, and it listened. The final known account came from a woman named Loretta Van, a genealogist tracing her maternal line. She claimed to be the great-granddaughter of Clara Marlowe. In her recorded tapes, she described the house as a body made of stories, but the kind that can only be spoken through walls. She claimed the house was waiting, not for a person, but for convergence. It remembers all of us, she said, but it cannot finish itself until we all forget. Her final tape ended with a soft humming, the same lullaby heard in Ellen's final hours, reversed, slowed, and echoing through what sounded like a room with no floor. Loretta vanished the following week. Her car was found with the keys in the ignition, facing the hill. The door was open. The seat was warm. There were no footsteps in the surrounding mud. What the house became was not a curse, not a mystery, but a medium, a translator between the unsaid and the never known, the architect of recursive memory. It did not survive. It evolved. It became a structure that only existed in the retelling, gaining walls with every new whisper, gaining rooms each time someone dreamed about a corridor they could not exit. It became larger in absence. And now, even the silence it once relied on has become noisy, because we are all telling the story. Even now, as you read this, the house hears your breath. It folds or pauses into its floorboards. It aligns your fears with its hallways. And if ever you dream of a house with no doors and too many windows, with stairs that descend forever and voices behind the wallpaper, you have already been there. You never left. And it has already begun building you into its next room.